Welcome back, friends. We are here to talk more about couples and sex therapy. My name is Zara Somani. I am a licensed marriage and family therapy associate working at Relevant Connections. I'm here to talk about all things relationships and sex related. I am South Asian and I love bringing light to topics like this to remove the stigma and the shame around it, especially around topics and around sex. So I'm super excited to talk to you today. I have with me Dr. Kendall. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kendall. I am a licensed marriage and family therapy supervisor. I am also the owner of Relevant Connections, and I am a faculty member for National University where I teach couples therapy, sex therapy, and courses in addiction.
Awesome. We are ready to dive right in. So last time we talked a little bit about sex therapy and what it is and what it's not, the approaches, including biopsychosocial, and what are some of the factors that we think about when it comes to sex. Today, we're going to talk about why it's so hard to talk about sex. So, one of the things that I often like to bring attention to, whether I'm talking to friends or clients, is the messaging that we get around sex. So things like, when was the first time that we learned about sex? So I'll give you an example. I was telling a friend this earlier that I remember as early as maybe I was 4 or 5, and we were driving, my parents and I were driving home from some event or something. It was nighttime, and there was a sign, like a store sign that said unisex haircuts, but I was very young, so I couldn't read the whole thing. But I saw the word sex on there, and I knew enough to ask my mom, what does that say? What does it mean? Trying to get her to talk about something that I innately or somehow had picked up was taboo to talk about. And she kind of ignored it. She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then I had that there's a little perfume bottle in the car, like a travel size perfume, and it said sex appeal. And again, I was like, what does this say? And she's like, I don't know how to read. But if somebody who is 4 or 5 knows how to read the word sex, I'm not buying that. Um,
Hmm.
but what's really interesting about this, right, is what are the messages that are coming out immediately, even at that age? What are the rules that are coming out around sex? It's not okay to talk about, right? It's something that we ignore, or is in secret. There's something, unpleasant about it that we want to hide. It's not for kids. So these are really interesting ways in which, and I encourage you as you're listening to this or as you're talking to your friends or your partner later on, today or this week, to think about, when was the first time that you learned about sex and what were some of the messages that were coming out about that? Um, what do you think about that, Dr. Kendall?
Listening to your story, I was trying to think about like what were some of my earlier memories. And like yourself, I have very little, like my family obviously didn't talk about it. I remember, maybe I would be scanning the TV channels and come across HBO late at night. And I remember just feeling so like what if somebody sees that I'm watching this? But I think my biggest lessons on sex and sexuality came from like clothes shopping because I remember so often being told like, "Oh, you can't buy that. That's too short." Or, "No, you're showing your shoulders." Or going to school, they would literally like measure your, girl's shorts. And it always felt so like I always remember feeling confused and disappointed about like why can't I wear the things that I like? But then also this mess like this internalized it's like the cognitive dissonance of like, okay, well, I do want to cover up, like I don't want to be too sexy or too provocative. Like I don't want to be a bad girl like that. And so I think that is certainly where I learned early on that like sex and sexuality is something that should be hidden and that we don't talk about it. And that of course has shaped, my future in that way.
Yeah. I think when I think about, as we grow older, what are the messages? So, even in your story, I'm like, it's something that as I've worked in with youth, so in schools, at camps, working to change dress code policies because we're sending messages, right? That like, oh, your shoulder is a sexual object, or your knee is something that, can cause arousal and desire in other people. Like things that are not your sex organs are suddenly like becoming objects, like sexual objectification, right? and what message does that send to women about their bodies as dangerous, provocative, unsafe,
Mm-hmm.
a tool for manipulation, all kinds of things, right?
And you're being a tease, and you're creating this, danger for yourself that you need to be more careful about.
Yeah. I think that as we get older too, I think about some of the messaging that we get. So, it didn't occur to me until I went to school, right, for this and was like, oh, I'm learning about all these things that, I was like at some level know are true, but we never actually get education that's formal outside of like the fifth grade, like the birds and the bees, literally, right? How they pollinate, and this translates to you somehow because, but the messaging otherwise, if we think about it, comes from TV, from like
Hmm.
movies, from magazines. So anytime we're in the grocery store and Cosmopolitan is like, oh, make them orgasm 365 days a year.
Uh-huh. Be
Um,
the best kisser.
yeah, correct, right? And even in that statement, right? This like you make him orgasm. Also, we have to have, sex and complete, right? 365
Uh,
days a year, or that the pinnacle or the achievement part is the orgasm versus the experience itself. There's a lot of these messages that are coming across to us that I don't know that we don't ever sort of question or push back on, that we take for granted and that we then take into the bedroom space,
right.
which can cause a lot of problems. Do you see this a lot with your clients?
I see. Or I was just thinking about, yeah, on Cosmopolitan, there's so much about like looking perfect or being like presenting yourself in a certain way. And absolutely that fear, I think for a lot of women of wanting to not show up like as a messy human, right? And so always needing things to be perfect and getting caught being very much in your head during like more intimate moments, which really disembodies, it takes us away from our body and we can't feel and experience pleasure in the same way. And so, yes, I absolutely think that these messages can mess with women's heads and it definitely decreases pleasure in
Yeah.
during sex.
Yeah. I was reading an article the other day that said that of all the material that we're exposed to, about 15 to 20% is actually valuable in terms of like guidelines and like real life applicability. About 50% or 60% is titillating but irrelevant. And a
Right,
third of the information we get is actually quite harmful in terms
right,
of the messaging and the expectations. And I think about Dr. Kendall, you mentioned, sort of the burden on women to, sort of show up in a certain way or orchestrate these,
mhm,
interactions, or this fear that if you don't give it to him, he's going to go somewhere else for it. And the imbalance of the messaging too, and that actually men feel a lot of pressure also to perform, right? That anytime we're watching TV, very rarely do we see sexual encounters that don't end in orgasm or that don't go, literally
amazing.
picture perfect, when in reality, anywhere from 5 to 15% of sexual encounters are dissatisfying or dysfunctional. Um,
We talk a lot about like good enough sex in my practice, right? Like we all want to have amazing sex, but that's just not the norm. And we're all living busy lives or parenting, and we can't always have our hair done and be, amazing, right? And so sometimes good enough is okay, but we need to break these myths and stigma around like if it's not amazing, it's bad. And
Yeah, I think also this idea that when we're not aware that it's okay to not have great sex and good enough is okay,
right,
sometimes what I've heard, from clients is that, well, it didn't work out well this time. Like, like it was kind of a miss, it wasn't that great. I feel like my performance wasn't awesome. She couldn't orgasm. And it creates a sense of, like, a barrier to the next time. What if I can't
right,
perform again next time? What if this happens again next time? And this idea that it's an anomaly or it's weird that we couldn't perform as opposed to normal for anybody to experience this at least part of the time,
right.
ends up becoming a self-perpetuating cycle sometimes, which can be really unnecessary but damaging.
Right. I don't know why we see this as like a failure rather than oh, that wasn't great. I can't wait for next time because
Yeah,
now we're gonna top this one. But that's really not the way people see it. It becomes this like thing that defines our relationship rather than something that we can work together to improve upon.
yeah. I think that, sort of prevailing, um, it's interesting that we can have that relationship with results and other things, whether it's our work, sometimes our like fitness, right? Like these other sort of uh, aspirations that we have and we don't make it, and we're like, all right, that's fine. But with sex, it seems like the prevailing negative emotion is around shame.
Right.
Where do you see this show up?
Well, I was thinking about, all of the other topics that, and I'll talk about women just because we are, but if you think about going out to lunch with a group of women, right? It's okay to talk about our struggles in our marriage or our struggles with our kids or the struggles we're having at work. But very rarely, if ever, are we going to really hear women talk about, like, oh, I'm really struggling to orgasm, or I'm really struggling to please my partner, or this or that. And I think that message around that we were talking about earlier around we don't talk about it, our families didn't talk about it, society doesn't talk about it, then we perpetuate this in our adult lives and there's no safe place. And then we're not taught how to talk to our spouses. And so there's nowhere to talk about it, right? And so it just becomes a self-perpetuating problem that then gets buried deeper and deeper with the shame of like, oh, well, I should just be able to do it. It should just be innate. It should just happen organically. And that's just not true. There are very few things in this world that happen organically and beautifully and perfectly, every time. And so it is just a self-perpetuating problem, I think.
Yeah. I also think about, we talked about the biopsychosocial, and I think a lot about part of the messaging around sex is the current sort of education we get. And a lot of it, I think, comes from the programming that we get as children. I know that I was telling somebody the other day that I had a friend who was living with her in-laws who were recent immigrants from India. And I was, her daughter was 2 at the time. And she's like, Zara, my daughter ran into the room, pulled up her skirt, pointed to her vagina, right, and said, shame, shame, which if you are from South Asian cultures, you will recognize this word, shame, shame, which is when you slow it down, shame, shame. So literally at the age of 2, she's pointing to her genitals or her sex organs and associating them with shame. Um,
Right,
I think for some of us, it's like not something that registers, but for others, it is very much something that then becomes, if it gets reinforced with other messaging like dress code or reputation conversations, right? Like a lot of times growing up, and I talk about this in my own master's research about gender role expectations in South Asian women, is this idea that the health of the family in terms of its reputation rests on the woman, and that
right,
is solely based or largely based on how she looks, but also like her like how sexual she is or how not sex. Are you talking to boys? Are you staying in your lane? Are you dressing, like
right,
appropriately? And a lot of these sort of this pressure, right? Of, like when I was a kid, the worst possible thing that could happen is getting pregnant, like literally, right? Like we live and die by that fear.
right.
Um, and then there's no sort of transition to like, don't have sex, don't have sex, don't have sex. When are you getting married?
Right, or that woman that you just described who is like stay in your lane, like be all these perfect, like wonderful things, and then at the same moment she's expected to be able to just take that mask off, walk into the bedroom and be a vixen and to be fun and passionate. And it's really hard to make that it would take a master artist to be able to make that transition from this to that. And that is a tough place for women to be put into.
Yeah. Do you see this in other communities besides the South Asians?
I think there are certainly flavors of it everywhere, right? And that, I've grown up and lived in the Bible Belt. I was raised in the church, and I work with a lot of clients who are also raised in various religions where we are also taught to be the good girl, right? And like I was saying earlier, like it's my job to not be too provocative. It's my job to put on this chaste, front, but then and purity culture, right? Like don't do anything before marriage, but then the minute you get married, it's like just flip that switch, turn it on, and embrace your sexuality, but only in the bedroom and only in like these very certain ways. And that is just it takes the fun out of things that are supposed to be fun and pleasurable.
Yeah, I think that what you just said right now about keep it in the bedroom is also something that's really interesting to me. I was listening to a podcast the other day that talked about like our primary sort of drives are, food, sleep, and this like sexual energy or this creative, but sex and sexual energy and creative energy are one and the same. They come from the same place.
Right.
So this idea of using that creativity, right? Like even at its core, right? Sex is a biological process that leads to creation of humans. But this
Right.
creative energy of, harnessing kind of your power, right? And what does that look like um, from a place of like deep comfort with your sexuality?
Right.
It doesn't necessarily look like parading your sexuality around, right? But just not like not a discomfort with it, right? Like an ease and an acceptance of it. And what does that look like?
Like you can love yourself in and out of the bedroom.
Yeah.
But you bring up a fun topic of, I think in one of our future videos, we're going to talk about power play and kink and diving into all of the fun and different ways that we can embrace sex and our sexuality. So just a little spoiler.
Yes, a little teaser. It's once yeah, I think that's a good point. Like once you kind of start at baseline of like, all right, we're good with this. This is not something I need to be afraid of. What are the other levels that we get to explore, the different avenues we get to explore? Something I see a lot in, and I hope I'm excited to talk about this because I think it's a topic that doesn't, it often gets a stigma as opposed to just, a light shined on it. And I'm really excited to talk about it because I think that there is so much to be explored in this area once we take off the shame. So
Right.
often I hear one of the reasons I got into this profession is because I heard so many of my South Asian, um, you know, women around me being so just either like sex became a tool to have kids, but otherwise was just not something that they enjoyed engaging
Right.
with. I've seen men just sort of be stuck in these spaces where they can't have that conversation with their wives. And this is
Right.
particularly disappointing to me for a couple of different reasons, right? Like, in South Asian culture, there's such a rich sort of understanding of women, bodies, sexuality.
Mhm.
Even in Islam, it's a sex positive religion, right? Like scriptures talk about, laying with your wives. That there's, hadiths that talk about foreplay, right? There is it is not only permissible, but like something to work on, like this relationship that you have with your partner. It's not something to be relegated to the side for the purpose of having a baby and then let's move on, but we
Right.
miss all of that. And it's like it's really sad. It's unnecessary, to be struggling in this space.
Absolutely. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in Islam, doesn't it say your wife should come first, like orgasm first? Or
Oh,
somebody told me that, and I thought, and I, because it stuck, I was like, oh, maybe I should convert. But I feel like that was in the scripture somewhere, and
you know,
so I just wanted to check to see if you'd read that.
I would totally am going to look this up as soon as we finish, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised actually. There are various ways to interpret the Quran, so it depends on who's looking at it. But that's not like I wouldn't be genuinely wouldn't be surprised, right? That like there is not this sense of like take, take, take. It is a very giving space in relationships, and that's made very clear, right? And whatever that giving looks like, that you're not to just use your wife for your pleasure and that's it.
Right.
The other thing that I always like talking about in conversations around sex that I feel like a lot of people maybe don't know yet is, the purpose of the clitoris, which to date we have not found any other purpose for it besides pleasure.
Pleasure. Yeah. I thought that was his put. That is his purpose.
Yeah, as in like there's no like thank you. Yeah, so that the
Why does it need to
function.
be more?
Exactly. And that there's an entire, body part within you whose sole purpose, right, and actual like, existence is to pleasure you. And what does that mean in terms of even just how we think about one of the things that also bothers me often in conversations is how much, especially women, diminish the role of pleasure.
Right. Yes. That is a huge sort of mind shift that has to happen for a lot of the women that I work with, is that it is okay to enjoy this. It is okay to ask for my pleasure. It is okay to embrace this, right? And really lean into it, because good girls don't do that, right? Which is the message a lot of people have gotten. And so undoing that takes a lot of work.
Yeah. And I think that when we talk about sexuality as it's so much more than the bedroom, right? Like it's so much
Mhm.
more than what takes place under the sheets. It is
Right,
about when we embrace that sexual, creative, powerful energy for men and women, right? What
right,
does that actually translate to? When we think about pleasure, I think this concept of pleasure also extends to like it's really hard for women to take time out for themselves, for
right,
self-care, right? For
right.
any sort of enjoyment of life. It feels, often that the women that I come across are very service oriented at the expense of pleasure and self.
Right. And many women, because they don't take care of themselves, by the end of the day, they're so depleted that when maybe their partner does initiate, it becomes this thing of like, okay, just check that off the list, right? Let's just get it done so that I can, finish serving you. And so I've taken care of my kids, I've taken care of my boss, I've taken care of my husband. So now it's okay. I can go to bed now and give myself the sleep I need, which that is not what our sexuality is about. That's not good for anybody.
Right. And I don't know that the partners in that situation feel any better. I
No,
think yeah, right. There's this sense of like, I don't want to be another thing you take care of. Like, this should be mutual enjoyment. And often when we are not, um, showing up in that kind of way, our partners feel it and it takes away from it reinforces this message that like, we're a means to an end when actually that's
right,
usually not the actual paradigm in a relationship, but it becomes the outside messages that we bring into our relationship that can be really damaging.
right. And I know this makes a lot of men feel unwanted, right? They have sat and told me and that it feels like she's just, like I'm bottom of the total. I'm at the bottom of the priority list. I'm not a priority. I don't matter. And I'm not desired. And that feels really awful too. And so now we've got two partners again who are mutually hurting, but we don't know how to communicate it.
Yeah. What's the first step in this conundrum?
Well, and I think it depends, right? If you're coming, some couples will come in directly and they want to talk about like sex, but some couples come in because they're just feeling disconnected. And so sometimes we're kind of going through, it's like peeling an onion, right? And it just depends. And so probably we're going to start with just like, where is the relationship not working? Like maybe there's a lack of communication around daily needs or getting tasks done. And so we start way up here and as we do the work, we kind of get down to the more intimate spaces, which is going to include like those deeper feelings around sex and being rejected and not loved or desired.
Yeah. This can be often like the most challenging topic to bring up within couples. Like it's easier to talk about the dishes than it is to talk about your
Oh,
sexual
for sure.
relationship. I also think this is where it's really critical that whoever your therapist is comfortable talking about this. One of the things that I went to school specifically for this, but when I got there, realized how many of my colleagues were like uncomfortable with this, and
Right,
actually don't like talking about it. And that's where a lot of like therapists, we also have to go and do our own work on this and make sure that, our come from is clean and that we're good with, talking about these things and that we're not necessarily bringing in our morals or perspectives on this, but
right.
leaving space for our clients to talk about it.
Right. I always begin these conversations like, what does healthy sexuality look like to you, like both of the partners? And so this is me helping them get to their goals and not necessarily something that I'm going to put on them, or this is what you should be wanting, or this is where we should be headed. But I really want to take that time to have a conversation. And like, when you think about your best sex life, like, what does that look like? And then we're going to work to get there.
Yeah, I think this should be and should gets really in the way because often again, like those messages about good sex and, what does a good sexual relationship look like are informed by things that aren't necessarily representative of real life or accurate.
Right.
One of the things that, clients often get confused about is or like have misconceptions about is what does sex look like, right? Like so if we're looking at oftentimes like an entire sexual episode might last anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, of which intercourse is maybe 2 to 7
Right.
minutes of that, right? Whereas like I think there's this concept or this idea of like, all right, am I thrusting for an hour? Like what's happening? Is that am I not doing it right? If she's like, if sex is shorter, like is that okay? Right. And there's a lot of this like, is it okay? Am I doing this right? And again, like
Right.
you said, a lot of times we're not talking about sex with our friends So you're
Right.
sitting in isolation, understanding like, is this, am I doing this right? And the messages you're getting from TV are like, actually, you're not.
Right.
Really mess things up. So one of the things that I love to do is talk about, what the realities of sex looks like, what is healthy for us as a couple, as opposed to what should be for like as deemed by outsiders,
Let's set some reasonable expectations for what we're going for, because this is not Hollywood.
Yeah, correct. Even this idea of like, how we talk about sex. I was watching this TED talk about, when we talk about like ways in which we understand sex, like the baseball paradigm, right? Or the game, like I scored third base. There's so many other references, right? Like
Yes.
to
Yes.
sex and baseball, which makes it like really feeds into this like competitive paradigm.
Somebody wins.
What was that?
Somebody wins,
Yeah,
right? If
somebody
only
wins.
one person can win.
Exactly. In a game, only one person can win. So, and I think we're so used to this, right? That often, okay, either the guy wins or the girl holds out, or, like there's this sort of
Right.
competitive sense versus, yeah, the TED talk I was listening to talked about comparing it to pizza, which I thought was
Oh,
really
I use food comparisons all the time. If you do sex therapy with me, we're going to talk about what you like on your pizza or what your favorite restaurant is. Yeah.
right. Because every time we order pizza, right, it gets to be a conversation of what do we want on our pizza. It could be the regular, or I might go totally different. And I mean, I love pineapples and beef on mine, right? Sweet and salty. But like maybe I want extra cheese today. But it's great because we get to talk about it in a way that is, we're both mutually satisfied. And that there's like you know, an engagement with pizza and dinner conversations that's different than, hey, I'm going to score and win this game. It's a much more respectful, mutually respectful way to approach it.
You just reminded me of an analogy I use with a lot of my couples when we're talking about like the duty sex or the check it off the list sex, which is like if like your partner, say your partner loves sushi, right? And like you're not really hungry, you don't really like sushi, but you're like, fine, I'll go to the restaurant, right? And so you sit there and you like poke at it and you're like tasting it and you're like, okay, fine. Right. That is gonna make for a really awful like dinner date, right? You're gonna be like, "Ugh, why did we even do this? I should have just gone through a drive-through. Like, I don't even want to be here, and it's going to leave us both unhappy and unsatisfied, right? And so maybe we do need to sit down and say, okay, well, maybe you're not in the mood for sushi, but would you like to go, get some Chick-fil-A or, some Mexican food? Like, what is it we can find that would be mutually acceptable for both of us? Maybe we just want to have drinks and an appetizer, and that is okay too. It doesn't always have to be the full meal. It's just but we do need to talk about like what we want and how we want it.
Yeah. I hope for our audience that this has been, if this resonated with you, if you're feeling like, oh, yeah, I have these questions or these, thoughts, I'd love to have these conversations. We encourage you to, broach the conversation with your partner if you can. See if you've got friends that, are open to having these conversations that kind of help, warm the entry point. And if you're looking for some extra support, come see us. This is what we're here for. This is what we specialize in, is providing the space sometimes just to get you started. And this is the thing about therapy, whether it's couples or sex therapy or individual, is sometimes, we have the relationship we want. We don't always have the space, or we need support in like a third space being created for us to come together and talk about these things, or to learn how to talk about them in an environment that is coached and safe. So if you found interest in this, we're so glad. Send us more ideas for topics you have. We still have a lot more to talk about sex in another episode. We'll get into kink, poly, all the other things, and a lot more topics to come. So thanks today for listening. Thanks, Dr. Kendall, and we will see you guys later.
Bye.